So, here we are at this pivotal moment in the written history of an ancient people, a people whose journey we have been following as we traverse the Hebrew scriptures this year. We've seen them fight, fumble, and sail through floods, and now, after 400 years of slavery, they are about to walk free, liberated by a God who goes by the name of Yahweh and who has chosen this moment to reveal God's self to them. But first, today's reading takes us to a very dark place, the climactic finale of a series of plagues cast upon the people of Egypt in an attempt to force their leader, Pharaoh, to release the Jewish people from bondage. It's an act of unthinkable violence, apparently an act of God, the murder of every firstborn across the land. This reading is a rich text. There's a lot going on. We have conversations between Yahweh and Moses, Moses and Pharaoh, Moses and the Jewish people. We also have details of the first Passover meal, a tradition that continues in Jewish communities across the world today. I'm not going to spend much time talking about that aspect of the text, not because it's not important, but because, firstly, there's too much else to cover. And secondly, because as a non-Jewish person with a fairly low level of literacy in Jewish culture and tradition, there are, frankly, people who can cover that more adeptly than I. All I'll say is that as a non-Jewish person, I am most likely approaching this text very differently from how someone in that community would. Instead, I really want to focus our attention on the 10th plague, the death of the firstborn, and try to understand what it means, where we find God in it, and what it demands of us as a contemporary, primarily non-Jewish audience reading this text today. This reading also contains significant violence, and in discussing it, we're going to be covering some heavy themes. I'd really encourage you to be gentle with yourselves during and after the sermon. Be mindful of how you're feeling, and please feel free to stand up, step out, or move about at any time if you need. The pastoral care team, would you mind giving us a wave? They're here to support you if you need anything during or after the service. Okay, let's get into it. For so many of us, myself included, this story was first encountered in Sunday school. A story of Yahweh's victory over Pharaoh and Yahweh's people over their captors. Deep in the suffering of slavery, a people cry out and Yahweh intervenes. It's a tale of good, triumphing over evil, of a wicked Pharaoh powerless against the strength of the one true God. Those chosen are liberated, while their enemies are smited, the lines between the us and the them drawn with a single swift and deadly stroke of God's almighty hand. Really. Look through this text and it's easy to find oneself asking why these plagues were needed at all. If the God of all creation wanted to liberate their people from bondage, could they not have just willed this into being? The text even tells us that God hardens Pharaoh's heart so that the plagues can be performed in full. As Adrian asked in his sermon on Abraham earlier this year, what kind of story is this? What kind of God? Perhaps it's helpful to remind ourselves that this story is myth-making at work. As with all of Scripture, we know that this story was written by a specific group of people for a specific purpose at a very specific time. Let's recall the context in which this text was written. Most likely during the Jewish people's Babylonian exile, a time when the leaders of the community sought to canonize certain truths that would preserve the longevity of their people. Since their time in Egypt, the community's fate had changed considerably. They had wandered through the desert before coming to the land of Canaan, where they undertook a merciless and bloody invasion, killing all of the land's inhabitants. They'd fought violent battles, they'd cast out foreigners among them, and they had done unspeakable things, unspeakable acts of cruelty on those that they demarcated as the other. All this is to say that by the time this story was written down, countless texts of terror, as feminist theologian Phyllis Tribble dubs them, could be compiled about the exploits of this once subjugated people. And so, looking back to their time in Egypt and seeking to instill a new wisdom, what might the authors of the Exodus story have been trying to communicate? Several theologians, including Peter Enns, discuss the 10 plagues as a form of decreation, of creation coming undone. their literary construction establishing the plagues as a sort of deconstructive antithesis to the creation story of Genesis 1. For example, Enns notes that the authors of Exodus have grouped the 10 plagues into 3 groups of 3 that then culminate in a final 10th plague. He links this structure to the events that happen in Genesis 1, 3 pairs of creation that play out over 6 days. Moreover, each plague represents a sort of undoing of creation, if you will, a dissolution of the natural order that's carved out in Genesis 1. The River Nile, the source of life for the Egyptian people and their ability to sustain themselves, flows red with blood. It becomes undrinkable, unusable for fishing, the holding of ceremonies or agriculture. Frogs swarm out of the river and cover everything on the land. Locusts suffocate the skies, and the dust from the ground rises up, forming uncontrollable swarms of gnats. Animals fall down with pestilence, hailstorms unleash chaos, and the sun is blocked out for 3 whole days. And then, in a striking blow to the creation of life itself, the firstborn of every household is struck down overnight. Could all of this symbolism and structured form be intended as a warning? A warning of what happens when power is prioritized over dignity and human life. A reminder that the greed of empire, the enslavement of one people to serve another, was so despised by God, such an affront to creation itself, that creation became undone. That these are evils that cannot be sustained. Such evil begets chaos, an undoing of creation. It causes that which was created to decreate itself. Perhaps. But while reading the plagues as decreation may provide one way of understanding this story, it doesn't take away from the extreme violence it contains. Preparing for this sermon, I found myself reading and rereading and reading again the story of the 10th plague in a very specific context. At home with my newborn, my firstborn child, Yuri, who just exited the building. Yuri was born on the 1st of January this year. As Yuri's early days turned to weeks and then months, I became increasingly angered at the violence of this passage. Where is God in this story when the mothers of Egypt cry out? Does God simply abandon the Egyptian people as decreation takes place? Because it's not just Pharaoh's house that suffers, is it? The text is really quite clear about this. From the house of Pharaoh to the slave working the handmill to the prisoner in the dungeon, every house in Egypt receives the same fate. They go to sleep one night, and when they wake, the firstborn of every family is dead. But more still, those who are themselves oppressed, criminalized, and cast out, they face this hellish nightmare too. Locked up in Pharaoh's dungeons with no part in his imperial pursuits, the prisoners, those who have been enslaved, must endure this horrific act of decreation. They too are gripped by death in the darkness of night. How do we make sense of this? What kind of God is this? One way to cope with this horrific violence is to deny it, to say that this text was written by people different from us in a time different from ours. Their understanding of these events, we might say, as divine act of violence, is not how we should understand these events today. That may be true, but denying the experience of another's encounter with the divine is a pretty dangerous game, particularly for us to play. It's certainly true that the God of this story was encountered in a vastly different context. Among other things, this was a context where gods frequently battled on behalf of their chosen people, and this need not dictate the way we encounter God today. But isn't part of this purpose of this series to wrestle with these texts and to see if we can trace, in whole or in part, our connection to the divine through these ancient scriptures? In that vein, I think it's possible to say that these acts of violence may have been an act of God, and that by virtue of being God of the universe, God is capable of unspeakable violence. But we also know for certain that violence alone does not represent the wholeness of God. If we consider that each part of Scripture reveals to us something new about the nature of God, We need to put this story in context of Scripture in full, right from the beginning of creation to the work of the prophets, the incarnation of God through Jesus, and all the peaks and perils of the early church. And what does this context tell us? Time and again, we see that God shows up for the oppressed, releases the captives, and calls for justice for the poor. This is a God whose creation contains multitudes and who works on a timeline that we do not always understand. But one thing we can be sure of is that God is on the side of those who suffer, whose society villainizes and casts out. In fact, as abolitionist theologian Reverend Nikia Smith-Roberts says, God cares so much about the outcast, villainized, criminalized body that God chose to enter this world through the body of a criminalized man, a brown man whose bodies we know are disproportionately criminalized. Someone who was villainized, brutalized, imprisoned, and then killed. Someone who knew unspeakable violence and who died at the hands of a violent empire in a cruel and untimely way. This tells us something about where God is in the story of the 10th plague. God dwells with the persecuted. God dwells with the oppressed. And while it's true that in this story God dwells with the Jewish people in bondage, we cannot apply that notion selectively. The enslaved woman and the prisoner in the dungeon and all those trapped within the cycle of violence inflicted upon them by the powerful, God dwells with them too. Those who experience suffering, those for whom death comes in the darkness of night, God dwells with them. God is in that place. The message of the gospel reminds us that those who suffer can be absolutely sure that God dwells among them, that God, the mother, weeps for the loss of the firstborn, that as a cry rings out through Egypt, through this place, through West Papua, through Palestine, as mothers beat their chests and mourn the loss of their children, that the God of the universe is with them. So, where does that leave us? What does this story ask of us today? Wrestling with this text, steeped in its violence, its patriarchy, its brokenness, is there a blessing that we can find? In his analysis on Exodus in the Queer Bible Commentary, J. Michelson draws our attention to the moral commandments handed down to the Jewish people after their liberation from Egypt. Specifically, he highlights Exodus 22:21. You shall not wrong or oppress the foreigner, for you were foreigners in the land of Egypt. I think the second part of this verse is important. By placing the commandment, do not wrong or oppress the foreigner, within the context of the Jewish people's own oppression in Egypt, the verse takes on a dual purpose. It serves both as an instruction and as a reminder to the community to treat others justly, doing so in memory of your own oppression in a foreign land. I wonder if the same can be said for the fate of the Egyptians in this story. Perhaps in reminding the Jewish people of their time in slavery, Exodus 22:21 also puts the community on notice, warning of the chaos that descends when power remains unchecked, when one group of people subjugates another, when injustice takes root. A warning to these newly liberated peoples. Do not abuse your freedom to treat others unjustly. Remember your oppression and the fate of those who oppressed you. This could be meaningful for us too. As we read the Exodus story, perhaps we're called to remember the 10th plague, to focus our minds on the fight for justice and liberation, but also to remember that the consequence of injustice is death. Rather than reading the Exodus story as one of good over evil then, could it be that these lines are blurred? Could it be that this story turns upside down our conception of the us and the them, the binaries of good and evil that we so often look for in mythology, and instead calls us to see how deeply entangled all of us really are? How the greed of empire that enslaved the children of Abraham so too brought hardship on the people of Egypt. How our liberation is all bound up in one another's, and our fight for justice cannot and must not end until we are all truly free. Contemplating this, I was reminded of a quote from Mahmoud Khalil, the Palestinian student who was kidnapped by immigration officers in the USA earlier this year. On March 8, Khalil was taken from his family and threatened with deportation for his pro-Palestinian activism on campus at Columbia University. Imprisoned without trial for speaking out against the genocide of his people. Khalil wrote this: "I have always believed that my duty is not only to liberate myself from the oppressor, but also to liberate my oppressors from their hatred and fear." What generosity in those words. What unparalleled kindness and love. In the face of so much cruelty, injustice, and hate, Khalil held space for his oppressor. Personally, I can't even begin to imagine being in his shoes, and if I'm honest, I wouldn't hold even a myocum of that generosity for anyone who treated me with the prejudice Khalil himself has faced. It's his people who know far better than most the violence of empire today. But reading his words, I can't help but think that Khalil is fluent in the teachings that I am still grasping at from this Exodus story. That liberation is not a zero-sum game. That we all stand to gain from justice and equality, and that those who spread violence, hatred, and fear require liberation from the evil they embody. That we fight for justice for the sake of the oppressed, but also for the sake of the oppressor, whose hearts will be eaten away by evil and whose own suffering is inevitable until their evil is abandoned too. There's no denying the violence of the world we inhabit and the distance between the world as we know it and the world as it is meant to be. But while the violence of empire brings chaos and destruction, people like Khalil give us hope. Hope of liberation for the persecuted. Hope of liberation for those who persecute. And while the work of restoring creation takes time, the God of that creation will not abandon those who suffer as decreation takes place. That God is working with us and among us to bring about the justice we know will one day come. Our task is to keep fighting for that justice, to keep working until creation is restored to its full and perfect self. Because then, and only then, will the rivers no longer run with blood.